The rightly guided caliphs. The death of the Prophet caused an emotional outpouring in the streets of Medina. The Muslims had a very difficult time dealing with the fact that their Prophet was no longer with them, with some initially refusing to believe the news. But the death of Muhammad also brought questions of leadership to Medina. For over 20 years, Muhammad had led the Muslim community both politically and spiritually. His direct connection with God meant that society was guided by divine power in accordance with a divine plan. Now that connection was no more, what would happen to the society that Muhammad had established? Specifically, who would lead the Muslim community after the death of the Prophet? Before Muhammad was even buried, a group of leading figures from among the Meccan emigrants and the people of Medina gathered to answer the question of leadership. Disagreements between the groups about who should be given authority over the young Muslim state could threaten to divide the community indefinitely. There may have even been some proposals for a two-state solution, one led by a Medinese and one by a Meccan. In the end, Umar nominated Abu Bakr to be the political leader of a unified Muslim state based in Medina. Abu Bakr was the natural choice. After Qadiyah, he was the first person to accept Muhammad as a prophet and convert to the new religion. He had been with Muhammad during his flight from Mecca. He was even appointed by Muhammad to lead the prayers in the Prophet's mosque in the final days of his life. Yes, he was from the people of Mecca, but no one, neither the Muhajirun nor the Ansar, could dispute his qualifications. Abu Bakr. Abu Bakr took the title of Khalifatul Rasul, meaning successor of the Messenger of God, shortened as Khalifa, Caliph, in 632. The Caliph was not a new prophet. Islamic scripture is clear that Muhammad was the final prophet and no more would come after him. Rather, the Caliph's role was to act as a political leader, following the example set forth by Muhammad in his time as the leader of Medina. Thus, the Caliph was expected to be someone who is an adept leader, capable of efficiently managing the affairs of the Muslim state, as well as someone who can preserve the religion of Muhammad and inspire people to follow it to the best of their abilities. Abu Bakr's example in doing so would serve as the precedent for later caliphs of how to fulfill these roles. Establishing continuity with the political goals of Muhammad, Abu Bakr dispatched an expeditionary force to southern Syria to battle with the Byzantines, in retaliation for an earlier confrontation between the two sides. The expedition showed that the Muslim Ummah's political goals would not stop because of the Prophet's death. But it was not as important as a growing threat coming from the sandy desert to the east of Medina. There, the various Bedouin tribes that had recently converted to Islam began to rebel. Their logic was simple: they pledged allegiance to Islam at the hands of Muhammad, and since Muhammad had now passed, that oath held no weight. Perhaps another reason for their desire to break away from Abu Bakr's government in Medina was the traditional Arab dislike for organized government. For centuries, the Arab tribes had roamed free, without a central government dictating their actions or demanding taxes. They may have begrudgingly accepted such an arrangement under Muhammad, but they would certainly not accept it under Abu Bakr. Coupled with their hatred for organized government was the appearance of numerous people claiming to be prophets themselves, chief among them a man by the name of Musaylima, known as Musaylima the liar in later historical sources. Neither kill a child, nor a woman, nor an aged man. Bring no harm to the trees, nor burn them with fire, especially those which are fruitful. Slay not any of the enemy's flock save for your food. You are likely to pass by people who have devoted their lives to monastic services, leave them alone. Abu Bakr's warfare rules, dictated to his army. The refusal of these tribes to pay the zakat tax, an important pillar of Islam, combined with their acceptance of new prophets, led Abu Bakr to declare that they had left the fold of Islam and constituted a threat to the religion itself. If groups could decide what aspects of Islam they chose to accept, or could declare themselves prophets and adapt the religion to whatever suited them, the sanctity of Islam itself could be lost amid hundreds of versions. No doubt the examples of previous peoples that were mentioned in the Quran who had altered God-given religion to suit their needs came to Abu Bakr's mind. Those people were reprimanded by God and would be punished on the Day of Judgment for their sins, a fate the pious among the Muslim community desperately sought to avoid. As a result, military action had to be taken by Abu Bakr. He appointed Khalid ibn al-Walid as the commander of an army to be sent east to crush the rebel movement. Khalid was well known throughout the Arabian Peninsula. He had not lost a single battle he had fought in, both before and after conversion to Islam. His familiarity with desert warfare and mastery of cavalry made him the obvious choice to lead the expedition. After successfully defending Medina from any possible attacks by the rebels, Khalid led the army eastward to where numerous rebelling tribes were based. Musaylama's forces were no match for the military ability of Khalid. The rebels were routed and Musaylima was killed in battle. One by one, armies loyal to the caliphate spread throughout the Arabian Peninsula, calling tribes back to Islam and battling against those who continued to rebel. By 633, the wars of apostasy were over, and the entire Arabian Peninsula was once again united as a Muslim state. Islam had survived its first political challenge, born out of the questions of loyalty to Islam and its political leadership after the Prophet. The wars of apostasy set an important precedent regarding the future of the Muslim world. First, the conflict showed that the spiritual unity of Islam was of paramount importance. Deviations and false prophets would not be tolerated. According to Islamic belief, previous nations that had been called to monotheism and deviated from God's laws were given the benefit of additional prophets sent to straighten them out. The finality of Muhammad's message meant no more prophets would be coming to fix the errors of deviant Muslims. There could be no room for error in keeping Islam as authentic as it was during Muhammad's life. Khalid's military expedition showed that the Muslim world was even ready to take up arms to protect the divine message of Islam. Second, the political unity of the Muslim world was ensured for the time being. There was only room enough for one leader of the Muslim world. The Arabian Peninsula was situated between two world powers, the Byzantines and the Sassanids. If they were to survive in the international arena, unity was necessary. The wars of apostasy confirmed that there would be only one Muslim state, the caliphate, under one Muslim leader, the caliph. Third, and perhaps most important, the authority of the central government was confirmed. To the Arab tribes, unity and acceptance of a central government based hundreds of kilometers away was a foreign idea. The wars of apostasy set the tone that subsequent Islamic history would be, ideally, a break from the nomadic, decentralized past of the Arabs. The Arabs were entering a new era in their history, and their government had to reflect it. Besides reinforcing the continuity of the Islamic State, Abu Bakr's time as caliph was significant for the preservation of the Quran in written form. During the Prophet's life, numerous secretaries were assigned to write down new revelations of the Quran as they came to him. These manuscripts were not compiled into a bound book, but rather existed as fragments scattered throughout Medina. Arabia was, after all, an oral society, and few people could read and write. the written pieces of the Quran were not as important as the memorization word for word. During Abu Bakr's caliphate, Umar suggested that all the various manuscripts be collected, checked against the memories of reliable companions for accuracy, and stored in a central location, just in case the unlikely scenario that all those who had the Quran memorized would die out. Despite his initial hesitance to do something that the Prophet himself had not done, Abu Bakr went along with the plan, and a collection of the Quranic manuscripts was assembled in Medina. Abu Bakr's caliphate lasted a mere 2 years, from 632 to his death in 634. In those 2 years he managed to stabilize the Muslim state after the death of the Prophet and prime it to take advantage of weakening imperial powers to the north. His 2 years set the precedent for what role a caliph plays in Muslim society and the continuation of Muslim belief after the death of the Prophet. The last precedent that Abu Bakr set was through the nomination of his successor. Rather than choose a relative of his to lead his community after his death, as had been tradition in Arab society before Islam, Abu Bakr chose someone whom he believed was most qualified and capable of handling the job of the caliph. While on his deathbed, he nominated Umar ibn al-Khattab as his successor. Umar. Like Abu Bakr, Umar was an early convert to Islam. He accepted the religion at the hands of the Prophet in Mecca before the Hijrah, and was with him at all the major battles and events in Medina. There could be no doubting his credentials to lead the Muslim state, and based on Islamic tradition, there appears to have been no disagreement regarding his succession to office. This kind of stability in governance and succession would be sorely missed later in Islamic history. Unlike Abu Bakr, Umar did not have to deal with questions of political stability or the continuity of the religion. The entire Arabian Peninsula was united under his command. The massive military effort that spread throughout the peninsula in the wars of apostasy gave the Muslim state the confidence and skills to begin thinking seriously about territorial expansion to the north. Furthermore, the traditional Arab way of life that was confined to the Arabian Peninsula was no longer feasible. For centuries, Arabs had survived through the continual raiding of rival tribes and the subsequent spoils of war. Now that the vast majority of Arabia was Muslim, such raids on neighboring tribes meant contravening Islamic law. The Prophet had spoken on numerous occasions about the entire Muslim population being one ummah, or nation. It was inconceivable that that nation would go on through history in constant conflict with itself. Partly to remove chances of inter-Islamic conflict, and partly to provide security to the few Arab tribes that were converting to Islam within Byzantine and Sassanid borders, the Muslim armies turned north, where their greatest conquests would come. Raids into Sassanid-controlled Mesopotamia already began during the last year of Abu Bakr's life, and continued once Umar took power. At first, Umar and other leading Muslims probably did not foresee these raids turning into permanent conquests. But a devastating war between the Byzantines and Sassanids that lasted from 603 to 628 left the imperial powers weak and unable to hold off waves of Arab Muslims arriving at their borders. The fertile lands of Mesopotamia and Syria were ready to fall. All that was needed was an organized assault by the Muslims. This would be a new type of war, however. Unlike the campaigns of destruction that the two empires had waged, the Muslim calls for war were combined with the calls for justice and social harmony consistent with the message of Muhammad. When Abu Bakr sent out the first armies, he ordered his forces to secure the safety of women, children, and the elderly, to leave monks in their monasteries unmolested, and even to refrain from destroying crops. These rules could not have been more different from what the Arabs engaging in these conquests were used to before Islam. But Muhammad's movement had been revolutionary from the start. Old ideas, traditions, and ways of life had to give way to a new order, and that extended to warfare. Armies were simultaneously sent into Syria and Mesopotamia in 633. Khalid ibn al-Walid, fresh off his victories in the wars of apostasy, led the detachment headed towards the Persians. Meanwhile, Yazid, the son of Abu Sufyan, led the armies sent to Syria, where he quickly managed to defeat a Byzantine force near Gaza. For the Byzantines, the surprising loss indicated this could turn out to be not a routine raid, but a full-scale invasion. Emperor Heraclius ordered the imperial army to mobilize and prepare to crush the Arabs before they were able to consolidate their victory. The Medina government was aware that this was a possibility, and Khalid was ordered to immediately leave Iraq, where he had already had some success, and travel across the waterless Syrian desert to reinforce the armies there. The combined Muslim forces met the Byzantines at the Battle of Ajinadain, about 30 kilometers west of Jerusalem, where the Muslim armies completely routed the imperial force under the command of the emperor's own brother. The remaining Byzantine troops in southern Syria retreated to the well-fortified cities of Jerusalem, Caesarea, and Gaza, leaving the victorious Muslims free to roam the countryside of Palestine. The Muslim armies under the command of Khalid moved north and laid siege to the ancient city of Damascus, which fell in September 635. The treaty he forged after the city capitulated was intended to allay the fears of the locals. In it, Umar promised that their lives, property, and religion would be safeguarded from any harassment, so long as a tribute to the Muslim government was paid. This set the tone for the fighting, that it was aimed at the Byzantine government and army, not the civilians. With such guarantees, there would be a much lower chance of rebellions by the Syrian population, which was essential considering that a relatively small Bedouin force was now beginning to occupy a large and diverse province in Syria. The loss of Damascus caused the Byzantine emperor to assemble an even larger force, with the hopes of sending the Arabs back into the deserts for good. Khalid knew his raiding force was no match for the bulk of the imperial army and decided to withdraw south, stalling the inevitable climactic battle between the two sides. Eventually, Heraclius' army caught up with the Muslim force at Yarmouk, along the border of present-day Jordan and Syria, in the summer of 636. The Byzantine force was much larger, better equipped and better trained. But morale was low as numerous rivalries and quarrels caused friction in the ranks. Taking advantage of this and the familiarity the Arabs had fighting in rough terrain, the Muslim force decisively defeated the Byzantines. The Byzantine army was chased off the battlefield and ceased to be an effective fighting force, capable of any military action. Emperor Heraclius was forced to concede defeat in Syria, as he had neither the soldiers nor the money to hold off the Muslim invasion. Cities throughout Syria fell one by one, all of them given terms similar to the ones given to Damascus by Khalid ibn al-Walid. By 638, the conquest of Syria was complete. From there, the fight against the Byzantines continued in Egypt, which fell relatively quickly, by 642. Two of the Byzantine Empire's most valuable and prosperous regions had fallen into the hands of a people they had scarcely considered important enough to recognize before Islam. In 70 AD, the Roman Empire exiled Jews from Jerusalem. It was not until the Muslim conquest in 637 that they were allowed back to the Holy City. Within a few years, Syria had gone from a land firmly under the control of Byzantine Empire to a province of the growing Muslim Empire. For the victorious Muslims, the conquest must not have seemed that surprising. After all, they believed that God was on their side so long as they adhered to the religion that He sent down through Muhammad. The examples of Badr and the conquest of Mecca from the time of the Prophet proved to them that victory was possible in the face of overwhelming odds with God's help. For the Byzantines, the loss of Syria was simply the first domino to fall in the final decline of the successor to the Roman Empire. Imperial armies would never again march through Christianity's Holy Land, nor would they ever again reap the economic benefits of this fertile region. For the locals living in Syria, however, the Byzantine loss did not have much of an impact on daily life. Churches continued to operate, peasants farmed land, and trade caravans passed through as they had before. To help sort out the civil administration of the region, Umar personally traveled from Medina to Syria. One of his first actions in the country was to relieve Khalid ibn al-Walid of his post. This no doubt shocked everyone, including Khalid himself. Among the many possible reasons for forcing Khalid into retirement, Muslim historians in the past tended to settle on Umar's desire to remind the Muslim armies that God, not Khalid, was the reason for their victories. If the Muslims could sustain their streak of battlefield victories without one of the greatest generals of all time, it would serve as proof for those with weak faith of the divine guidance and help for their mission. When it came to governorship of the new province, Umar appointed Muawiyah, the son of the Meccan aristocrat Abu Sufyan. He hailed from the wealthy and powerful Umayyad family, which had a major role in the administration of Quraysh before Islam. That lineage of governance would serve Muawiyah well in turning Syria from a new province to the economic and political heart of the Muslim world over the next 20 years. While Umar was in Syria, he personally attended to the surrender of Jerusalem. In 637, he was given a guided tour of the city by the Patriarch Sophronius, an Arab Christian who had risen to become one of the leading figures of the Greek Church in Jerusalem. The terms of the treaty that was signed with the leaders of Jerusalem was similar to others put in place throughout Syria. What is unique about the Muslim conquest here, however, is that the new governors of Jerusalem allowed Jews to come to the city to worship for the first time in over 500 years. Islamic scripture holds the Christian and Jewish religions in special esteem, calling them the people of the book. It would not have made sense in Islamic law to allow the Christians freedom to visit their holy sites in Jerusalem, while upholding the Byzantine laws preventing Jews from doing so. This precedent of freedom and religious pluralism was based on Muhammad's Constitution of Medina, which Umar was of course intricately familiar with. Yet, while acknowledging the rights Christians and Jews had in Jerusalem, Umar was keen to send the message that the city also belonged to Islam. According to Islamic belief, this was the city to which Muhammad traveled in his miraculous night journey from Mecca, where he prayed on the site of the house of worship built by his fellow prophet Solomon and then ascended to heaven. There could be no minimizing the importance of Jerusalem in the Islamic tradition, and with this in mind, Umar set about cleaning the Temple Mount, which the Romans and then Byzantines had let fall into disuse. Upon the mount he erected the first version of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site in Islam. After the fall of Syria, the attention of the Caliph went back to the Sassanid Empire, which had been mostly ignored since Khalid was ordered to move his armies to Syria. Umar appointed another veteran of Arab warfare who fought with the Prophet, Asad ibn Abi Iwaiqtas, to lead the Muslim armies into Mesopotamia. Despite initial setbacks due to the Arab inability to deal with war, elephants, Assad's army managed to defeat the Persians at the Battle of Qadisiyah in late 636. The battle saw significant spoils fall into Muslim hands, much of it forwarded to Medina for distribution according to Islamic law, and the temporary defeat of the Sassanid army. If the Muslims really wanted to hold Iraq, however, they would have to take Ctesiphon, the Sassanid capital. Ctesiphon was not a well-defended city, it lay on the plain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, about 60 kilometers north of the ancient city of Babylon. After a siege that lasted about 2 months in early 637, the imperial city fell to the Muslim forces. The entire Tigris-Euphrates plain was now firmly under the control of the Muslim armies, with the Sassanid emperor and his government fleeing into the Persian highlands. Despite the string of impressive victories, Umar forbade his army from pursuing the Sassanids outside of Iraq. In Mesopotamia the land was familiar enough to the Arab tribesmen that traditional military tactics proved useful. In the Iranian plateau, the Arabs would be unfamiliar with the terrain and could be decisively defeated. Furthermore, the native population there was entirely Persian, unlike in Iraq, and resistance from both the Sassanid army as well as the locals could be expected. The royal standard of the Sassanids was captured at Qadisiyah and taken to Medina. Rather than keep it as a symbol of Islam's victory over Persia, Umar ordered that it be destroyed and its jewels and gold be sold to feed the poor. Umar's time as caliph is noteworthy not just for his military conquests, but also his administration over conquered territories. One of the most impressive aspects of the conquests and subsequent incorporation of them into the Muslim Empire was the fact that life barely changed for most inhabitants of the conquered lands. The Byzantine and Sassanid armies and aristocratic class left as the Muslims moved in, but the local populations remained untouched. There were only two main changes in the lives of the conquered people. The first was who they paid their taxes to. Whereas previously they had paid taxes, oftentimes oppressively high taxes used to fund the ongoing wars, to the governments in Constantinople and Ctesiphon, now they paid a tribute, in accordance with Islamic law, that was forwarded to Medina. In most cases, this tribute did not exceed the previous taxes, and oftentimes was much less. For an everyday citizen, lower taxes are usually good news, regardless of who collects it. The second major change was the religious tolerance given to certain groups. Monophysite Christians, who differed from the ruling Greek Orthodox on matters of the nature of Christ, were allowed to practice their religion in Syria, a welcome change from the oppressive nature of the Byzantine government. Jews were similarly relieved of official oppression and were allowed to go back to their holiest city, Jerusalem, to worship. In the former Sassanid lands, Nestorian Christians saw increased religious freedom, as the ruling Zoroastrians had routinely restricted their freedoms on suspicions of being secretly allied with the Christian Byzantine Empire. Tensions of course still existed between religious groups, especially since the settled Christians of the Fertile Crescent probably resented the rule of nomadic Semites from the desert, but overall, the egalitarian nature of Muhammad's message helped usher in an era of religious tolerance that had mostly been absent in the Middle East previously. In economic terms, the conquests brought unimaginable wealth to the relatively simple Arabs. Thousands of silver and gold coins and valuable gems flowed from conquered lands, particularly Iraq, into Medina as part of the spoils of war. In keeping with the precepts of Islamic law, the spoils were considered to belong to the entire Muslim community and were divided among members of the from the earliest converts to Islam to the newest non-Arabs to accept the religion. A huge boom in economic activity ensued in Mecca and Medina, with new houses being built regularly and huge estates being established to provide continued economic growth after the conquests ended. For the first time in Islamic history, immense wealth came into the hands of a Muslim government. Through 10 years as the caliph of the Muslim world, Umar had taken the young Muslim state from a desert-based raiding society to a regional power. This rapid expansion coupled with social stability is proof of his incredible capabilities as an administrator and leader, and he has thus gone down as one of the most successful rulers in Islamic history. His reign came to a sudden end in 644 when he was murdered in Medina by a Persian slave who had a personal grudge against the charismatic leader. While on his deathbed, Umar appointed a council of 6 well-respected leaders of the community of Medina to choose his successor from among themselves. They chose Uthman bin Affan, another early convert to Islam, who unlike Abu Bakr and Umar came from the Umayyad clan of Mecca, and was a very wealthy and powerful man before accepting Islam. No doubt, seeing the success of Umar's policies, Uthman promised to follow in Umar's footsteps and uphold the same practices as the deceased caliph, which led to his appointment in late 644. Uthman's descent from an aristocratic family played a huge role in his decisions. As caliph, the Umayyads had ample experience in administration dating back to the days before Islam, and Uthman relied on that experience in his personnel decisions. His cousin Muawiyah was already the governor of Syria, and was doing an admirable job in transitioning that province from a frontier territory to the backbone of the Muslim state. Uthman proceeded to appoint his foster brother, Abdullah ibn Said, as governor of Egypt, hoping that Umayyad lineage would serve Egypt as well as it did Syria. Other cousins of his were appointed in Iraq, where they led raids into the Persian homeland, slowly conquering the rest of the Sassanid Empire. There were some allegations of nepotism for the first time in Islamic history, although they do not seem to have been serious enough to hamper the efforts and capabilities of the expanding Muslim state. During Uthman's caliphate, a Muslim embassy was sent to China to establish diplomatic relations between the caliphate and the Tang dynasty. Continuing in the footsteps of Umar and his emphasis on the military, Uthman ordered the construction of the first naval fleet in Muslim history, intended to thwart any Byzantine counterattacks. Governors in Syria and Egypt relied heavily on the expertise of the local Christians in building seafaring vessels. Christians, who had formerly been under the sovereignty of the Byzantine Empire, seemed to have showed enthusiasm in their work for their new Arab governors, especially considering that many of them belonged to the Coptic Church and other Christian denominations that were not recognized by the Byzantines. The Muslims' willingness to treat them better than the Byzantines must have played a huge role in their loyalty to the caliphate. The result of this was peaceful civil society, and security from external threats, as a Byzantine fleet attempting to recapture Alexandria in 646 was thwarted by Christian sailors in the employ of the caliphate. Besides simply defending its borders, the Muslim Empire was able to expand its influence in the Mediterranean, capturing Cyprus and Crete, and raiding as far away as Sicily. Military success also continued on land, as Muawiyah led his powerful Syrian army into Armenia against Byzantine rule. The mountainous terrain of Anatolia, coupled with its mainly Greek population, meant a natural border between the Byzantines and the Muslims developed around the modern border of Turkey and Syria. Further east, Muslim armies continued to push into the Persian heartland, under the command of another of Uthman's Relatives, Abdullah ibn Amir. The conquest of the rest of the Sassanid Empire was not as rapid as the conquest of Iraq. Here the society was more homogeneous and connected to the Sassanid government. As a result, the war exacted a heavier toll on the Muslim armies. Still, the completeness of the Muslim victory at Qadisiyah during the caliphate of Umar had essentially sealed the fate of the Sassanid Empire. It was simply a matter of time and effort to subdue the rest of the empire. Sassanid Emperor Yazdijerd was never able to fully replace the army he lost in 642, and over the following 10 years, the Sassanids were constantly on the defensive. By 650, the Iranian plateau was secured, and by 651, Khorasan was taken. That same year, the last Sassanid king was found while on the run and executed. Within a decade the Muslim armies had pushed from Iraq to the river Oxus, reaching the edges of Central Asia. For Uthman, leading a rapid military expansion like Umar did not result in the same popularity as the second caliph. Trouble began to fester as discontent with his administrative policies, particularly his appointment of fellow Umayyads, began to take shape. Coupled with this, the slowing conquests, in comparison to Umar's rapid expansion, meant less booty made its way into Medina, resulting in economic stagnation. Uthman's popularity was certainly not as high as his two predecessors, but it would be a stretch to assume a massive revolution was brewing that would remove him from power. Instead, it was a small band of soldiers who would bring violent and chaotic change to the Medinese government. In 656, a group of soldiers from Egypt came to Medina to protest directly to the caliph regarding his policies and the division of spoils between the army and the civil government in Egypt. He listened to both sides of the dispute and promised to take steps to solve the problems equitably. On their return to Egypt, the soldiers intercepted a letter supposedly written by the caliph to the governor of Egypt ordering their execution. They returned to Medina and besieged Uthman in his own house. Despite the mortal danger he was in, Uthman refused to order that the people of Medina arm themselves and fight the rebels, and even prevented his cousin Muawiyah from sending a force from Syria to protect him, lest blood be shed in the city of the Prophet. Many of the remaining companions of Muhammad opposed this mutiny, but were powerless to stop it. Martial law reigned in Medina and its residents could only watch in horror as the rebels eventually forced their way into Uthman's house and murdered him as he sat reading his copy of the Quran. The caliph was dead, and with him so was the unity of the Muslim world. Ali. As the kingmakers of Medina, the rebels sought to appoint a new caliph themselves. Ali was the natural choice, as he was the most respected companion still alive, and was related to the Prophet in two ways: as a cousin and son-in-law. Ali, holding on to the unwavering honor and justice that many of the closest companions were known for, initially refused to be appointed by people who had rebelled against the caliphate. He was eventually persuaded by other leading figures in Medina that he was the most qualified and best equipped to bring back peace to the Muslim world. As it turned out, however, no personality would be able to manage the crisis that the Muslim world stood at the precipice of. Ali's most pressing problem was dealing with the murderers of Uthman. There was popular sentiment in favor of punishing the rebels. Muawiyah even insisted that he would not pledge allegiance to the new caliph until steps were taken to punish the people who killed his cousin. But Ali, being as pragmatic as his predecessors, knew that to punish them would likely lead to his own assassination, as the rebels still controlled Medina. This would in turn force the Muslim world into a downward spiral of bloodshed. that he was keen to avoid. Instead, he moved his capital to Kufa, in the fertile plain of Iraq, where support ran high for the embattled caliph. Many in Medina were disheartened by his resistance to bringing the rebels to justice, and soon a force gathered with the intention of convincing Ali to punish them. Led by two fellow companions, Talha and Zubayr, and aided by the Prophet's widow Aisha, the army departed for Iraq to confront Ali. It is difficult to judge the intentions of Ali and his political opponents in their preparations for the coming conflict. On both sides there were people who were close to the Prophet and must have been aware of the severity of fighting among Muslims. Yet both sides believed themselves to be entirely correct in their ijtihad, or independent reasoning, regarding the correct course of action in dealing with the rebels. For Ali, punishing them was not politically feasible, as he believed the best solution was to move on and attempt to reunify the Ummah. For his opponents, reunification was impossible without fixing wrongs and sending the message that the caliphate could not be violated as it was during the siege of Uthman. Both arguments probably had elements of truth in them, but the political divisions that came from Uthman's death were too big for even the companions to solve. Disunity was inevitable. Eventually, in 656, the supporting armies of the opposing ideas met at a field near Basra, in southern Iraq. Some members of the opposition, including Talha and Zubayr, met with Ali before the battle, hoping to avoid bloodshed. A tentative peace treaty was agreed upon by the leaders of the opposing sides, who were loath to see fighting between Muslims just over 20 years after the Prophet had been laid in his grave. Less pious-minded extremists on both sides still urged the soldiers to come to blows with each other, despite the negotiations of their leaders. In the confusion, the two armies finally collided, each believing the other side had started the fighting. The Battle of the Camel, as it came to be known, was indecisive, with both sides taking on heavy losses. Talha and Zubayr were both killed in the mayhem. Ali and Aisha escaped the battle unharmed but were disheartened at the first battle between Muslims in history. Aisha retired back to her home in Medina, accompanied along the way by a military escort for her protection, appointed by Ali. She dissociated herself from politics until her death in 678. Despite this bloodshed, Ali's hold on the caliphate was still not secure. Muawiyah had remained neutral in the conflict between Ali and the dissenters from Medina, but continued to withhold his allegiance until Ali punished his cousin's murderers. Ali could not effectively govern while one of the most powerful governors of the Muslim world did not submit to his authority, but he still held on to his position that punishing the rebels was not a priority and was not feasible in any case. This time, to prevent further bloodshed, he agreed to meet with Muawiyah to settle their dispute through arbitration. The two sides met at a site midway between Iraq and Syria, their respective bases of support, in 658. Exactly what happened at the negotiations and their outcome is difficult to judge through the fog of history, but it seems that the arbitrators favored a solution that removed both Ali and Muawiyah from power and resulted in the election of a new caliph. When results of the arbitration were announced to the opposing sides, a group of Ali's supporters decried the results, declaring, "Decision belongs to God alone," and refusing to accept the legitimacy of the arbitration itself. The group condemned Ali for allowing his political fate to be decided by mere humans capable of error. Their extreme political position morphed into an extreme religious position, in which they deemed any sinning human to be an unbeliever. After separating from the main body of Ali's supporters, they were given the name Khawarij, or Kharijites, meaning the ones who left. The Kharijites went on to terrorize the Iraqi countryside, battling against anyone who disagreed with their fanatical positions. Meanwhile, Ali, who had rejected the results of the arbitration as being invalid, decided that his former supporters, who had now become the first in history to secede from accepted Islamic theology, could not be allowed to go about with their reign of terror. He assembled his army and confronted the opposition in the summer of 658, where the main body of Khariji support was destroyed. The movement continued in a more clandestine form, with the aim of removing both Ali and Muawiyah. An attempt to assassinate Muawiyah in Damascus by the Kharijites was unsuccessful, but they succeed in killing Ali. As he prayed the dawn prayers at the mosque in Kufa, an assassin stabbed the caliph, bringing his turbulent reign to a violent end. The caliphate fell to the only man left in the Muslim world with widespread support and the capabilities to be an effective leader, Muawiyah. 4. The establishment of the Muslim state. The death of Ali at the hands of the Kharijis and the rise of Muawiyah to the caliphate marks the end of the era commonly referred to as the rightly guided caliphs. The nature of Muslim government and society fundamentally changed during the 19 years of Muawiyah's rule from 661 to 680. Coming to power at a time when disunity and chaos reigned from Egypt to Iran, Muawiyah's political skill and competence helped prevent the Muslim world from falling into total anarchy from which it may never have risen. Yet at the same time, some of his policies and actions were controversial, and formed the basis for some of the biggest divisions in the Muslim world today. His reign marks the beginning of the Umayyad Caliphate, when succession to the position became hereditary and stayed in the Umayyad family until 750, when it was replaced by another old family of Mecca, the Abbasids. Muawiyah. Despite the attempts at arbitration, a real solution to the dispute between Ali and Muawiyah never took shape, and the last years of Ali's caliphate were marked by de facto division between the realms of Muawiyah and Ali. With the death of Ali, however, Muawiyah was free to extend his control over the areas formerly loyal to Ali and reunify the Muslim world under his command. Indeed, he was probably the only man at the time that had enough support to manage such a monumental task. He was incredibly popular in Syria, a province he had looked after as governor for 20 years before the start of his caliphate, and Syrian army formed the backbone of his military. He was not without enemies. However, particularly in Iraq, where popular opinion was in favor of the caliphate being inherited by Ali's son, Hassan. Ever the pragmatic statesman, Muawiyah had no desire to plunge the Muslim world into further warfare over leadership. So, instead of mobilizing the army to violently crush the opposition, he negotiated a deal with Ali's son in which Hassan would give up any claims to leadership and retire to a life of worship and scholarship in Mecca. Desire among some for rule by the house of Ali remained, although under the surface, and it never materialized into a real threat to the reign of Muawiyah. The Dome of the Rock Mosque was built in the late 690s as part of the Al-Aqsa Mosque complex in Jerusalem. Its design is largely Byzantine, and was partly engineered by Christians. The caliph also relied upon negotiation and deal-making with other potential opponents. In many ways, Muawiyah ruled like an Arab tribal leader from pre-Islamic Arabia, using family relations, an unwritten code of honor and gifts to get his way politically. Having been a youth in Mecca who saw how his father led Quraysh, these old traditions were no doubt ingrained in his political persona. At the same time, however, Muawiyah began to change the caliphate into something new, a monarchy. He was the first caliph to sit on a throne and the first to pray in an enclosed area in the mosque, protecting him from possible assassins. He no longer followed in the modest and simple footsteps of the first four caliphs. Instead, royalty and court culture became a part of the caliphate as it had been part of the Roman and Sassanid empires. For the first 30 years after the death of the Prophet, the caliph was simply a first among equals, and numerous anecdotes survive of the asceticism of those first four leaders, such as Umar being mistaken for a commoner or refusing the service of bodyguards. Muawiyah was the bridge between the simple caliphate that came before him and the monarchy that succeeded him. He would walk in the markets of Damascus in his patched clothing as enormous and elaborate mosques were built by his architects. As part of his overall program to de-emphasize political divisions among Muslims, Muawiyah chose to focus on expanding the borders of the caliphate. Reminiscent of Umar, who focused on outward expansion after the infighting of the wars of apostasy, Muawiyah sent armies to continue the war against the Byzantine Empire by land and sea. The important islands of Rhodes and Crete in the Aegean Sea were occupied by the navy first established under Uthman. Buoyed by these victories, the Muslim armies were, for the first time, able to lay siege of the Byzantine capital of Constantinople. The legendary city had been a prize since the earliest days of Islam, when the Prophet promised that eventually a Muslim army would conquer that distant and seemingly impenetrable city. As Muslim armies approached the city for the first time in 674, fulfilling that promise seemed to be within reach. From 674 to 678, the Umayyad armies laid siege to the city's massive walls, but lacked the manpower or technology to conquer the city. Among the casualties of the siege was the elderly Abu Ayyub al-Ansari, a notable companion of the Prophet who lodged Muhammad in his home when he arrived in Medina. He was buried near the walls of Constantinople, and almost 800 years later would become a mythic legend for the Ottoman armies that eventually managed to overcome Constantinople's walls. Expansion also continued in North Africa, where the Byzantines still had control west of modern Libya. The fringes of Umayyad-controlled land west of Egypt were governed by Uqba ibn Nafi, another companion originally from Mecca. In 670, he was ordered to advance into Byzantine Africa in conjunction with the ongoing advances into Byzantine territory in the Aegean. Uqba's army consisted of 10,000 Arab horsemen who were aided by huge numbers of local Berbers who had recently converted to Islam. Because of the Byzantine preoccupation with other fronts, Uqba was able to advance unchallenged into modern Tunisia, where he established the garrison city of Kairouan. The main threat ended up not being the Byzantine forces, but the local Berbers who had to be slowly subdued before any more advances towards the west could be embarked upon. Following a short period from 675 to 680 during which Uqba was replaced as governor of Afriqiya, the province of Africa, Uqba continued his westward raids. By 680 the Umayyad armies were well established enough in North Africa to embark on serious conquests across modern Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco, collectively known as the Maghreb, to the Atlantic Ocean. Uqba's role in these conquests would raise him to a legendary status for North Africa's Muslim population. After leaving Kairouan in 680, Uqba's army marched generally unopposed through the desert plateau south of the coastal mountain ranges that run along the Mediterranean. Advancing from one Byzantine outpost to the next, Uqba's army was able to quickly annex hundreds of kilometers of territory along the coast with relative ease, even as disunity and civil wars raged in the heartland of the Islamic Empire. One possible explanation for this seemingly miraculous conquest was linguistic, cultural, and religious division between the Berbers of North Africa and the Byzantine rulers. The Byzantines who ruled over North Africa could not be more different from the Berbers under their control. The Berbers were a desert people, closer to the Arab nomads who arrived in the 600s than the urban Latins and Greeks who had administered the area for centuries. Their language shared no history with the Greek used in administration, and few Berbers went out of their way to learn the language of their governors. The lack of common cultural traits meant a constant social divide between the two, and examples of full assimilation of the Berbers into Roman/Byzantine society are scarce. Religion, however, seems to be a larger factor that led to Berber support for the Arab Muslim armies. Early Islamic accounts speak of entire tribes of Berbers converting to Islam immediately upon arrival. There were certainly divides between North Africans and the Byzantines on issues within Christianity. The main issue was the nature of divinity and humanity. Separatist Christian movements, such as Arianism and Donatism, openly disputed the official orthodoxy promoted by the Byzantines and may well have caused North Africans to lean closer to Islam. But even if they did not all convert immediately, as early chroniclers claim, the Berbers certainly had practical reasons to rise up against the Byzantines in conjunction with arriving Muslim armies. Thus it was possible for Uqba's army to continue gaining momentum as it did through the early 680s until they were able to push into modern Morocco and to the shores of the Atlantic. His legendary words when he rode his horse into the crashing waves of the ocean hint at the deeply religious nature of these conquests. "O Lord, if the sea did not stop me, I would go through the lands like Alexander the Great, defending your faith and fighting the unbelievers." Whether or not he actually said those words is not as important as the role that heroic image would play in the minds of generations of military leaders that would rise out of the Islamic Maghreb conflict of succession. Despite his success in unifying the Muslim world after the troubles of Ali's caliphate, one decision Muawiyah made would make him a controversial character and change the nature of Islamic government for the next 1,300 years. He appointed his son Yazid as his successor well before his own death and demanded oaths of allegiance from the notables of Damascus. Muslim historians throughout the ages have speculated as to his reasoning for doing so, especially considering the subsequent opposition that arose to Yazid. However, keeping in mind the historical context of Muawiyah's time makes it easier to understand why the switch to a hereditary system made sense. Muawiyah's time as caliph showed the emphasis he placed on political unity and harmony. After the political upheaval of Ali's caliphate, Muawiyah's main challenge was keeping the Muslim world united under one command. Although he largely succeeded, there was no guarantee that all subsequent caliphs would be able to use external threats or political maneuvering to minimize internal divisions. Muawiyah thus felt that the only way to preserve social unity and harmony was to simply bypass wars of succession and make the caliphate hereditary. As it happened, however, the choice of Yazid was not without controversy. Unlike his father, he had never known the Prophet, and was thus without the aura that comes with being a companion. Furthermore, rumors swirled in the holy cities of Mecca and Medina of the sinful life that Yazid led. Alcohol, singing girls, and excessive luxuries were to be found in Yazid's presence, a far cry from the pious and simple lifestyle Muhammad had preached. Whether or not these allegations of wickedness were accurate, they were enough for some to revolt. Such as Abdullah ibn al-Zubayr, the son of the Zubayr who opposed Ali. Compounding the problem were the desires of some in Iraq to see a descendant of Ali take the title of Caliph of the Muslim world. Ali's oldest son Hassan had already died in Mecca during Muawiyah's reign, so support fell to his younger brother, Hussein. This grandson of Muhammad was attracted to the city of Kufa in Mesopotamia by promises of support from its people. Against the advice of Abdullah ibn al-Zubayr, who warned him that the people of Iraq will desert him at their first opportunity, Hussein set out to establish a base in Iraq in 680 from which he could oppose the Syrian Umayyads, as his father had done 25 years earlier. True to Abdullah's prediction, the people of Kufa abandoned their support for Hussein before he even arrived. Yazid had already sent a new governor to the city to root out any opposition and ensure that the population does not rise up in revolt against him, and it appears to be this show of force that persuaded the people to abandon their promises of support. Hussein had been counting on that support and only traveled with about 70 family members and friends, hardly a force capable of overthrowing Yazid. At the plain of Karbala, about 80 kilometers north of Kufa, Hussein was surrounded by Yazid's forces, which proceeded to kill the would-be rebel and most of his supporters. The Battle of Karbala would later become one of the founding legends of a new, divergent strain of Islam, the Shia. Abdullah ibn al-Zubayr's revolt did not fare much better. After the killing of Hussein, popular support throughout the Muslim world was against the Umayyad government. Hussein was, after all, the Prophet's dearly beloved grandson, and killing someone who had the Prophet's blood flowing through him was a shock to many of the more pious-minded. Abdullah used this opposition to Yazid to bolster his own revolt against the Umayyads, which he declared in Mecca in 680. After Hussein's death, with such support, Abdullah's revolt could not be stamped out as easily as Hussein's. In fact, Yazid was never able to do away with the revolt in the Hijaz and died in 683 without complete control over the empire. After Yazid's death, it seems that Umayyad control collapsed almost everywhere in the Muslim world. Yazid's successor, a youth who seems to have had no interest in government, only ruled for a few months before his own death. Abdullah declared himself caliph, and was given oaths of allegiance by people in Iraq, Egypt, and even the fringes of Syria itself. But through a mix of tribal politics and open fighting, the Umayyads managed to regain control of the caliphate under Marwan, a cousin of Muawiyah. Under Marwan and his son Abd al-Malik, the Umayyads regained control of Syria, Egypt, and Iraq, and eventually stamped out Abdullah ibn al-Zubayr's rebellion in Mecca by 692. The Umayyads had come back from the brink of extinction to regain complete control over the Muslim empire. This certainly was not the tranquility and harmony Muawiyah had hoped for when he appointed his son as caliph, but once the Umayyads were re-established, the period of civil wars between 680 and 692 seemed like nothing more than a small hiccup. In the late 600s and early 700s, the Umayyads continued with a second period of rapid military expansion and economic growth that would rival any period of expansion in Islamic history before or since. The fact that the Umayyads conquered most of Iberia in just 4 years with a few thousand soldiers indicates that they received support from the local population. Further conquests. Full consolidation of Uqba's conquests in North Africa had to be completed before further conquests could be undertaken. The Caliph Abd al-Malik sent armies to conquer Carthage, the final outpost of Byzantine control in North Africa in 698. With this, the last remnants of Byzantine North Africa disappeared. for good, as the former rulers of the land were forced to retreat to Sicily and Greece. Now the Muslim armies were primed for one of the most spectacular and unlikely conquests in history. Legend has it that a former Byzantine official, Julian, appealed to the new Muslim governors of North Africa to punish the Visigothic king of the Iberian Peninsula, Roderick, who had supposedly seduced Julian's daughter while she was under his care. Julian even promised to ferry a Muslim expeditionary force across the strait to Spain to exact his revenge upon the tyrant king. Whether or not Julian really existed, reports of unrest in Visigothic Spain along with pleas from persecuted Jews and unorthodox Christians must have played a role in the decision to cross the strait and venture into the Iberian Peninsula. Musa ibn Nasir, the Umayyad governor of the Maghreb, sent a force under the command of Tariq ibn Ziyad, a Berber convert to Islam, who in early 711 landed near a giant monolithic promontory on the south shore of Spain. He established his camp near the mountain, which became known as Jabal Tariq, the Mountain of Tariq, anglicized as Gibraltar. From this base, Tariq led raiding parties throughout the south of Spain, which proved to be generally successful, especially since Roderick and the main bulk of the Visigothic army was in the north of the peninsula dealing with the Basque rebellion. By the time Roderick was able to march his army south to meet the Muslim forces in the summer of 711, Tariq had managed to bring over an army that numbered around 10,000 soldiers from Muslim North Africa. At the decisive Battle of Guadalete, Tariq's army crushed the amassed forces of Roderick, who suffered from disloyalty in his army's ranks, along with the effects of an exhaustive march to meet the Muslim invaders. Roderick himself was killed in the battle, and the underlying weakness of the Visigothic kingdom soon became apparent. Central control collapsed throughout the peninsula. Tariq advanced to take Roderick's old capital city of Toledo within a few months of the battle, and soon afterwards, cities began to fall one by one to the invading Muslims. Tariq's superior, Musa, also crossed over into Spain to aid in the ongoing conquest. Tariq was the conqueror and Musa was the consolidator. As expeditionary forces under Tariq took cities as far north as the Ebro Valley, Musa's larger army followed up to fully establish Muslim rule in conquered areas and set up civil government. In the years from 711 to 715, Tariq and Musa managed to bring the vast majority of the peninsula under Umayyad control. The seemingly improbable conquest of such a large territory by relatively small invading armies, no more than 10 to 20,000 soldiers, was reminiscent of the conquest of North Africa just a generation before. Many of the early Indian converts to Islam were Buddhists and members of lower castes, who were attracted to the egalitarian nature of Islam. Further raids to the north into Gaul initially proved to be as successful as the conquest of Spain. The Muslim armies managed to advance into the south of modern France, establishing their rule in Aquitaine and Septimania in the 720s. The climax of the Muslim invasion of Gaul was in 732, when armies under the Muslim governor of Al-Andalus, Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, were defeated by the Franks under Charles Martel at the Battle of Tours, in northern France. The importance of this battle has been thoroughly debated by historians. Some argue that a Muslim victory would have led to the eventual complete conquest of Europe and its subsequent conversion to Islam in the 700s. Others downplay the battle, making the point that al-Ghafiqi's advance to northern France was nothing more than a summer raid with no aims at conquest. Whether or not the battle really was that important cannot be determined, but one has to wonder at the Implications of what Muslim rule in France and beyond could have meant for European history in the Middle Ages. What makes Umayyad expansion in the early part of the 8th century so extraordinary is that it was not confined to North Africa and Spain. Simultaneously, on the opposite side of the empire, Umayyad armies were marching into an unknown land into which even Alexander's armies dared not venture. The impetus was a Muslim trade vessel returning from Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka, that was attacked by pirates based in the northwest corner of India. Sindh. When the king of Sindh, Raja Dair, refused to return the Muslim captives taken from the ship, Umayyad armies were again spurred to action to push the empire's borders even further. Under the command of Muhammad bin Qasim, a young man who hailed from the tribe of Thaqif, based in Taif, the same city that, according to Islamic tradition, Prophet Muhammad chose not to destroy. Although he was in his teens, Ibn Qasim proved to be an able leader under the tutelage of Hajjaj bin Yusuf, the governor of Iraq. He was sent with an army of 6,000 Syrian soldiers across Persia and into the Indian subcontinent in 711, the same year as Tariq ibn Ziyad's foray into Spain. Upon reaching the Indus River, several small communities capitulated to the invading force once given the promise of religious freedom. Aided by Buddhist temple officials, the Muslim army marched from city to city with relatively little resistance. When bin Qasim's force finally met Dair in battle along the Indus River, the Muslims, along with locals discontented with Dair's rule, managed to inflict a devastating blow on the Sindhi army. Dair himself was killed in the chaos of the battle, his war elephants being no match for the flaming arrows employed by the Muslims. Like in Spain, the loss of a major battle and the death of the king led to the complete collapse of local government. Muhammad bin Qasim's forces mopped up the remaining organized opposition within months, and established Muslim rule in Sindh. For the first time, a part of India was under Muslim control, although it would be centuries before Muslims would manage to establish control further into the subcontinent. For the locals living in Sindh, the Muslim conquest did not change their daily lives much. On the advice of his superiors in Iraq, Ibn Qasim extended the same religious freedom to Buddhists and Hindus that was already given to Christians and Jews elsewhere in the Muslim world. Temples and idols destroyed in the fighting were allowed to be rebuilt by the new Muslim governors. Once again, the relaxed terms offered by the conquering Muslims created little discontent with Muslim rule and relative social harmony. By the mid-700s, the Umayyad Caliphate stretched from Spain to India, making it the largest empire in the world just 100 years after the Islamic movement began high up on a mountain in Mecca. While expansion and conquest are usually signs of a powerful and capable government, a plot for the end of the Umayyad dynasty was being planned just as Umayyad armies marched into unknown territories. Where other rebellions against the Umayyads failed, this one would succeed as it capitalized on the many different ethnic groups that were now under Muslim control and their discontent with Umayyad social policies. The rapid expansion meant that a huge number of peoples came under Muslim control who were not Muslims themselves. The percent of the population that was Muslim in the early to mid-700s is estimated to be around just 10%. The rest being a blend of Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, Buddhists, and Hindus. According to Islamic law, these groups were granted religious freedom and were exempt from military service in exchange for payment of a poll tax, the jizya. Muslims, on the other hand, were only subject to a land tax and the zakat, a mandatory tax meant to be distributed to the poor. Although the jizya was usually lower than the pre-Islamic taxes of the Byzantines or Sassanids, it was still higher than the taxes paid by the Muslims. A natural economic reaction to this system would be for non-Muslims to convert to Islam in order to pay less tax. But this solution posed a problem for the Umayyad government. If all the non-Muslims in the empire converted to Islam, it would lead to a huge fall in tax revenue, making further military expeditions, not to mention luxurious Umayyad palaces, financially unfeasible. Consequently, a safeguard to protect revenue was put into place. Non-Muslims who converted to Islam were required to continue to pay the same jizya tax they had paid before their conversion. In theory, this would protect the Umayyad Caliphate from losing a valuable tax base, and ensure that all conversions would be sincere. In practice, it meant institutionalized discrimination based on race. Since the Arabs had almost entirely converted to Islam before the Umayyad Caliphate began, the only people who were converting into the religion were non-Arabs such as Copts, Greeks, Berbers, and especially Persians. They were the only Muslims paying the jizya, while their Arab brothers in faith were exempt. The intention of the Umayyads may have been to protect their tax base, but the policy ended up having a racial aspect, keeping non-Arabs at the bottom of society while Arabs rose to the top. From a religious perspective, this directly contradicted Prophet Muhammad's call for unity during the farewell pilgrimage, when he famously proclaimed, "No Arab is better than a non-Arab and no non-Arab is better than an Arab." An attempt was made by the Caliph Umar ibn Abd al-Aziz to undo the un-Islamic taxation policy during his reign from 717 to 720. Although his reforms were wildly popular with the non-Arabs of the empire, he was distrusted by his own family for his views of equality and was poisoned by the Umayyad clan just 2 years after taking power. Later Muslims would give Umar the honorary title of the fifth rightly guided caliph because of his religious-minded reforms. But in the end, his reign would be nothing more than a small hiccup in Umayyad policy. With ever-increasing numbers of non-Arabs accepting Islam, dissatisfaction at the unequal tax policy of the Umayyads grew. Riding this wave of discontent, another old family of Mecca rose to take control of the caliphate for themselves, the Abbasids. The Abbasid Revolution. The Abbasids take their name from the uncle of the Prophet, Abbas, who was the patriarch of the clan. They had settled in the land east of the Jordan River after the conquest of Syria, and generally stayed out of politics as the civil wars of the 600s raged. But sometime in the early 700s, they began to circulate a rumor that one of the descendants of Ali had officially transferred the right to rule to the Abbasids. Why he may have done this, or if it even happened in the first place, is a mystery. From a practical standpoint, it gave legitimacy to the Abbasids. Not only were they more closely related to the Prophet than the Umayyads were, but they could also claim to uphold the desires of those who supported Ali's descendants as leaders of the Muslim world. From their base in southern Syria, and later in Iraq, they sent agents east to Khorasan, where the Persian population could be counted on to support a revolt against the oppressive Umayyads. Throughout the 730s and 740s, oaths of allegiance and networks of allies were formulated, far from the Umayyad base in Damascus, with promises of a more equal society under their caliphate and vague assurances that the descendants of Ali would play a greater role in Muslim government, which was major desire for many Muslims in the eastern part of the empire. The Abbasids were able to secure backing from a wide spectrum of society. Support came from pious-minded worshippers who desired to see a government more in line with the Prophet's ideals, non-Arab Muslims who resented their second-class status, and loyalists to the House of Ali, who believed rule should belong to the Prophet's family. In 747 the Abbasids formally declared their open revolt, unfurling their distinctive black banners in the skies above the city of Merv, in the far east of the Muslim world in modern-day Turkmenistan. The revolutionaries were led by a mysterious figure known as Abu Muslim. Not much is known about him, but he does not appear to have been a member of the Abbasid family, and was probably ethnically Persian. Under his brilliant political and military leadership, the Abbasid revolution quickly secured control of Khorasan, which was soon to serve as a base for the movement. Abu Muslim sent armies westward, into the heart of Persia, where local Persian Muslims rose up against the Umayyads and joined in revolutionary fervor. What initially seemed like an insignificant expression of discontent in distant Merv now became a danger to the existence of the Umayyad dynasty as Abbasid armies flowed out of Persia and into the Arab world. Kufa, ever a hub of anti-Umayyad sentiment, rose up against its Umayyad governor and expelled him when the black Abbasid banners appeared on the eastern horizon. Once Kufa was liberated, formal oaths of allegiance could be given to the Abbasid claimant to the caliphate, Abu al-Abbas. The revolution had a clear goal: widespread support throughout Persia, and now, a leader to unite behind. Everywhere the Umayyads were on the defensive as more people flocked to support the Abbasids. Meanwhile, rousing the Umayyad supporters proved to be a challenge. It had been decades since the last real threat to the Umayyad position, and the Syrian army officers were content to remain on their estates, erroneously thinking the revolution would peter out. By the time the Umayyad Caliph Marwan II could muster together the Umayyad forces, the Abbasids had already taken control of the majority of Iraq. In early 750 at the climactic battle of the Zab in central Mesopotamia, the Abbasid forces completely routed the Umayyad army. Organized resistance to the Abbasids effectively ended after the battle, as Umayyad control collapsed throughout the Muslim world. Now nothing stood between the Abbasids and the Umayyad capital, Damascus. One by one, cities capitulated and accepted Abbasid sovereignty, and one by one, members of the Umayyad family were hunted down and executed. Marwan himself was captured in Egypt, where he was unsuccessful in building an army that would drive back the Abbasids and re-establish Umayyad control. Only one member of the defeated family managed to escape the revolutionaries. The teenaged Abd al-Rahman, a relatively obscure member of the Umayyad family, found a way to escape in disguise to North Africa. Pursued by Abbasid armies from Palestine to Egypt to the Maghreb, and aided only by a slave who had once worked for his family, his legendary journey led him eventually to Al-Andalus, where he would establish an Umayyad emirate far from Abbasid reach that would last almost 300 more years. The Abbasid Caliphate. The Abbasid revolution of the mid-700s inaugurated the second dynasty to control the caliphate. The revolt was based on the ideas of building a government more in line with prophetic ideals, giving non-Arabs a more equitable role in society, and giving the descendants of Ali some role in leadership. These broad and idealistic promises were necessary to secure the support of various groups of people that made the revolution successful. Once the Abbasids were in power, however, the reality of their caliphate fell far short of expectation. The revolution did not mean a return to the era of the rightly guided caliphs where piety, and not politics, dictated the decisions of the caliph. If anything, the Abbasid caliphs continued the same authoritarian traditions that they had denounced the Umayyads for. The caliphate remained a hereditary title in the possession of a Qurayshi family, and those who supported Ali's family as caliphs were left with unfulfilled promises. The Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid was known for his immense wealth and diplomatic relations with distant states. In 802, he sent an embassy to Charlemagne in France that included an elephant and a water clock. The one area where the Abbasids made real progress was the role of non-Arabs in society. Although the caliphate itself remained in Arab hands, administration was increasingly Persianized. For hundreds of years before Islam, the Persians had developed a complex but efficient bureaucratic system. Now that non-Arabs were no longer systematically discriminated against, this experience would be put to use in the administration of the empire. Recognizing the usefulness of the Persians caused the Abbasids to move the capital of the Muslim world closer to the Persian heartland. The second Abbasid Caliph, Al-Mansur, established a new city to serve as his capital in the fertile plain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in 765 near the old Persian capital of Ctesiphon. Within 20 years, Baghdad became the largest city in the world, with over 1 million residents. The seat of the Muslim Empire would become a metropolitan center where government, culture, science, and art would all intersect. A true understanding of the accomplishments of the Abbasid age does not come with discussions of military exploits and distant conquests, as it did with the Umayyads. In fact, outward expansion essentially halted when the Abbasids came to power. Seasonal raids across the border with the Byzantines remained, but the campaigns were generally indecisive. In the west, the Battle of Tours in 732 in Umayyad times meant the end of Muslim expansion into Europe, and consolidation of gains in Al-Andalus was the main focus of the Umayyad refugees. Who controlled it? In the east, only incremental gains were made in creating inroads into Central Asia. The Turks who roamed the Central Asian plains would not come into Islamic civilization through conquest, but through migration into the heartland of Islam in the 800s and 900s. The era of Muslim military conquest was over for the time being. Instead, the era of Muslim intellectual conquest was about to begin.